Welcome back. It's Chala from PS I Love You. Thank you so much for stopping by for today's card. I'm going to be using the Clearly Besotted Out of This World stamp set for today's card, as well as doing some ink blending with some Distress Oxide inks. We'll get started by just getting my A2 size card ready here. I'll be using the Distress Oxide Antique Linen, the Frayed Burlap, and Black Soot. I'm using this circle die here just to trace onto this card panel, just so that I don't have to ink up the entire area. It just gives me an idea of how much I have to ink up. And I'm going to start by making the moon that you saw on the card. And I'm laying down the antique linen just kind of here and there. That's kind of the base color of my moon. And then I'll be moving on to that frayed burlap. It's a little darker bit of a brown here. And just going in and adding some shadows onto that moon, making it look like the moon has some texture and some interest to it. And then once I get that shaded the way I like, I will move on to that black soot. Now I don't have very many ink blending tools, so I just switch out my little ink pads there. That doesn't bother me. I don't think I'd even have room to store all those ink blenders, so I don't mind just having one or two. So I kind of get that to the shading that I like, and then what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to spray some water from my little spray bottle onto the card here, and then adding some larger droplets just to create a little bit of effect of craters or divots on the moon. And then I just dab it off with my just my little cloth there. And then I just begin fussy cutting this out with my scissors, trying to maintain that nice circle shape. And then once I get that cut out, I will set that aside and I'll begin working on my galaxy background. Now this has a lot of colors to it. I'm going to start out with this beautiful picked raspberry color, and this is again a standard A2 size card panel here, just some Nina White Classic Crest cardstock. I believe it is 80 pound. And I just begin adding the layers of colors onto my card panel here. And this one is, I don't remember what color this is. This is the, oh yes, Seedless Preserves. And then moving on to Faded Jeans, this nice rich blue color here. And then this is just kind of adding that dimension look. I'll move on from there to the peeled paint. And then this looks horrible in the beginning, but the more colors you add and the more you blend it in, the better it actually turns out. So bear with me here, because this is a lot of blending. It takes a lot of time, but it is so worth it. So I'm just adding in these colors here. Again, I have sped this video up, otherwise we could be here all day. This is the Ice Spruce, so it's a little more of a gray-green color. And just adding, again, adding into some of where those white parts of the cardstock are showing through. And then really where all the magic happens is once I get all these colors blended together is when you bring in that black soot. I'll be bringing the black soot in and just doing that around the edges and then pulling it in toward the center of the card, and then that really is where the magic happens. So again, back and forth between these colors to get the blend that I like. It's all starting to come together now. A little bit more of that Seedless Preserve. That is really truly a beautiful, beautiful color. Just working in some of those lighter areas. Back to that peeled paint. I didn't want to use a yellow because I thought the yellow would be too bright, so this peeled paint was actually a really nice shade. Alright, so we're going to do the Iced Spruce again, just deepening the colors here, blending them a little bit more together. And then I try to wipe off my glass media mat in between just to make sure there's no transfer of color. I didn't do a very good job on that last one, but here's where the magic happens. When you bring in that black soot around the edging, it really starts to add like depth to your project. And just going all the way around the outside. Now I should have probably had a piece of paper underneath my left hand there, so I didn't get ink all over my hand, but I was in the zone, so I wasn't stopping at this point. So as you can see, it's really starting to deepen that all together and just really give you that feeling of that galaxy background. And then I do kind of lightly go over top of the entire piece there with that black soot. And that is really starting, I like how that's coming out. And ink blending is all just, it's really practice. So if you have some time, set aside some time just to play with some colors, see how they blend together and how you like it. And yeah, it's just really about practice and trial and error and what you really like personally. So I think that is where I'm kind of happy with all of this. So I'll clean up my surface here and put my ink away. And then from here, I'm going to be using this Hero Arts White Iridescent Shimmer Spray. I love this. So I have already shaken it, and I am going to spray that onto my project, and that adds just a beautiful shimmer to the entire project. And I'll try to hold it up here so that you can see that. It really, really sets off that background and really makes it feel like a galaxy. So that will need some time to dry. So I will go ahead and put that aside to dry, and then I'll begin my stamping. So I'm just using my stamp platform here, and I've pulled out the images that I want to add to my card. And I will be using my Memento Tuxedo Black ink here because I want to do some Copic coloring, and that ink will not smear with that alcohol ink. And just stamping these down. Again, that's just, I have a whole bunch of A2 size card panels already cut down, and that's usually what I stamp onto, and that's, again, that Nina White Classic Crest paper there. It really stamps well. And I stamp these twice. And then if you're not happy after you've colored them, you can go over them with a Copic black marker, fine line marker, or any other fine line marker that you have. Just be careful that that's your last step that you do, because if you add any more Copic markers over top, you could smear that fine line. So I've got those all colored up and cut out with the coordinating dies, and I'm ready to kind of begin the process of this slider card. So I'm going to set those aside so I don't lose them. And from here, what I did is I actually used a slider die mechanism that I had. I used rectangle die, and then there is a Lawn Fawn die set. I believe it is the double slider for the top there, that little notch. And I will link all of this in my description below, as well as on my blog. And this little mechanism here, this is the new slider, the Lawn Fawn slider mechanism. And I start with my bone folder here, and I'm going ahead and folding it back how you're supposed to put it together. And you'll see how I actually alter it in a bit here. So this is that mechanism that will slide off the top of the card and move my little spaceship that I want to come out from behind the moon. And then I get that all down, and I'll put it through this little slider here, and it moves up and down. I'm happy with how that's working on this little panel. And then I add my little spaceship here, and obviously that's too big for my spaceship, so I'm going to trace it out, and then I'll just trim that off. And then that'll be hidden behind my spaceship. So you can see here, I'm trying to figure out how this is all going to come together, do a little bit more trimming. Again, I'll link everything that I've used in my description here. I didn't want the video to get too long. So here's our moon, and because I have that stitching around the back panel there, I end up using that same stitching to cut off the moon to give it that seamless stitched bottom there. And then I pull it up to see how far I can go. And as I'm playing around with this, I'm really not happy with how it's working out. So I'm trying to problem solve at this point. I don't want that slider portion to show in the background, but that little track to show in the background, but I also don't like how high the spaceship is coming up. It's not coming up high enough for me. So I changed gears and I used this strip of acetate. I cut down a strip of acetate and I'm going to adhere that to that black slider portion that we created there. And then what that will do is will give me the height for the spaceship that I need and also be clear so you won't see it. That was my big thing. I didn't want to see that black slider portion. So I'll go ahead and adhere this acetate, down on here just with some of that score tape. And it will wiggle in the background and we'll fix that here. I've got this little strip of paper that we're going to wrap around this pull mechanism. And you just kind of fold it around. And then that will stop it from wiggling back and forth. Alright, so I'm just going to trim that down. And Lawn Fawn has a really great slider mechanism for this. So again, adhering that score tape now to the back of that little brace. And I'll slide that back on top here in a minute. I'm just burnishing this down to make sure that I get a good seal. It doesn't lift off. And I'm using my little trick here of just folding over part of the release tape. And then once I get it in the area that I want, I'll press it down. And then you can just pull out the remainder of that score tape. And for some reason it wasn't working. This was a day where I felt like my fingers were too fat to work anything. They just seemed to be getting in the way of what I was trying to do. So I kind of futz around with this for a bit. Get that peeled off. I had really burnished that down. Alright, so let's do this again. We get it all set up into the place that I want it, and we will press it down. And then here again you need to add a little bit more score tape just to close that up. And then once you've got it pressed down, that little mechanism is not going to slide willy-nilly all back and forth. Yay, it works! Alright, so from there, what I want to do is I'm going to lay everything on top again to see where I want it to be positioned. I'll slide my slider all the way down, and then that'll give me an idea of how high up I can place that little spaceship. Just marking where I need to cut off the bottom of that moon. And then I've just run that through the die cut machine with that rectangle die that I used for the panel, and that'll give me the same stitching. And now when you're placing, I wanted this to pop up a bit because that spaceship has to be able to go underneath it. I'm using some 3M foam tape here, but I want to make sure that I'm not placing it over top of where that slider mechanism is, otherwise it will not slide. So just making sure that's on either side. It's still hidden underneath my moon. I line up the moon and the stitching, wanting to make sure that my slider moves. And when I push it down, I wanted to get a good idea of how it will be hidden underneath there. So again, I take my time in planning this out. I put a little pencil mark there so I knew where to put the spaceship. I can now remove that release tape and adhere the moon on top. Kind of trying to line up those little dots on the bottom as well, just to make it look like it was all punched at the same time. or cut at the same time. I had a little bit of warping with my moon at the top there, but that's okay. And now to get the spaceship right exactly where I want him to go. So I want him to peek out just a little bit. And then I'll kind of add just a little piece of paper there so I know where it needs to go underneath. Use my reverse tweezers there, and I'll add some of that score tape on the back. I like the score tape because it is really strong. It really sticks down. You know that your project isn't going to come apart. Place that down with my tweezers. Press it into place. Had a little bit of the adhesive showing underneath there, so I just kind of push it out of the way with my tweezers. Rip it off. And then now I can trim away the excess of that acetate. When I push it down, it goes behind the moon, and I pull it up and it comes up, and I'm very happy with how that turned out. And now I can go ahead and I want to lay out where I want all my little critters to be. Oh, that makes me so happy that when things work. So I'm going to place the earth. I've got my little monsters or my little aliens. And then I'm going to figure out where I want my sentiment to be. I'm going to be doing some heat embossing with that. So I bring out my little stamp perfect here again. And I'll lay this all into place, trying to make sure that my sentiment is nice and straight. And then I'll be using the Versamark watermark ink here on the sentiment. And oh yes, the anti-static powder tool. This is very important when you're embossing, especially when you've used distress inks or distress oxide inks. You want to douse this completely over top of your project to make sure that your embossing powder doesn't stick where you don't want it to be. Because that's happened, and that's sad when that happens. So really coating this over top, making sure that it's got a good layer, because we did use water on this as well as that spray, that shimmer spray. And although it was set aside to dry for a bit, again, better to be safe than sorry with that powder tool. So I've now put that Versamark ink on the sentiment, and I'm stamping that down. And I'll be using the Ranger Detailed White Embossing Powder on this. And then just sprinkling it on over top. I've got my heat gun already heating up, because you want that good and hot. The less time your heat gun is on your project, the better, because it warps your paper otherwise. And I didn't want warping, because this has to be attached to the base of the card. So the less warping I have, the happier I am. So I'm going to bring that heat gun to my project, and it should melt that embossing powder rather quickly. You should see it happen here. And I noticed that there was a little bit of embossing powder out of place, so I used my craft pick there just to move it out of the way. And I go ahead and melt that powder. There's something satisfying about watching that melt. And I wanted to move that little spaceship out of the way because of that acetate. I don't want that acetate to melt with that heat gun. So just being very careful that that was out of the way. And then once that's all done, I make sure that my little spaceship can still move and everything's working fine. I haven't melted anything together. And then we'll begin adhering our little critters. Just clean up my work surface. Alright, so we're going to bring in our little characters here, and I'm just going to adhere them flat down. So I'm using my little tape runner and sticking them down. You can also use a liquid glue if you prefer, but this tape runner was handy, so I just used that. And I pulled my spaceship up just to get an idea of where I wanted my other elements to go. And we'll attach the earth there in the background. And then I'm going to add sparkle. My little, this is the clear, No, this is the silver, sorry, the silver Wink of Stella. I'm going to add that to my spaceship. I think everything needs a little bit of sparkle, and it really, really adds to the interest of the card. I like how it turned out. Now you also want to be careful when you're using this with your alcohol ink markers, because it can cause the color to move a bit, so always being really careful. And here's my card base, standard A2 side folding card, and I have gone ahead and on the top of the card there I've cut down that black slider piece, and I've used the element from the double slider card on the notch. You can kind of see it there on the top of the card, just to finish it off so it has that stitched finished look to it. And I use some of that Ranger White embossing powder to stamp an arrow on the top, just to show where, you know, that you had to pull that mechanism. Adding the 3D foam tape on the background just to give it some more dimension, and only removing that release paper halfway so I can get it lined up. Otherwise I find that if I remove all of the release paper, I get it stuck to my hands, and then it gets stuck down where I don't want it to be, and then that makes me sad. So this is just an easy way to make sure that your project gets stuck where you want it to go. So you can see that little arrow on the top there, and I'll go ahead and pull it, and my little spaceship is moving up and down, and that makes me really happy. Now I had some extra elements there that I had colored and cut out, so I'm going to adhere those on the inside of the card. And I kind of wanted to make it look like they were forming like a little monster pyramid there, so I'll lay those down, and with these guys I am going to adhere them with my Gina K Connect glue here, this liquid glue. It gives me a little bit of time to move them around before they adhere completely. And using those reverse tweezers really helps. Again, like I talked about me and my fat fingers, I feel like my fingers get in the way sometimes, and these tweezers really help to place things where, these small elements where I want them to go. So once I get those guys kind of all glued down there, I'll put my acrylic block on top and let it dry. And then that is the card. Now I did change my mind and I added there, you can see that shooting star element. I think that finished it off beautifully. A nice sweet little card. You can see the shimmer there with the spaceship. And I personalized the envelope for our special little friend and his birthday. So that finishes off our card today. Thank you so much for joining me. Again, all the information will be on my blog. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. You can subscribe to see my new videos. And if you have friends who you think might like this, please go ahead and share. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. And until next time, happy crafting.